Humanity walked away without a word. And the Galactic Council begged for their return. Part 1: The Quiet Before the Exit. The meeting had been going on for 3 hours, and nobody had looked at Nathan Cole once. He sat at the long curved table inside the Galactic Council chambers on Kelarath Prime. The room was enormous, full of colored lights and alien voices. Delegates from a dozen species talked over each other in their own languages. Translation earpieces filled the air with soft murmuring. The walls glowed faintly blue, which meant the session was officially in progress. Nathan had his notes in front of him. He had been working on them for 2 weeks. The proposal was simple. Human-aligned star systems in the outer belt had been producing grain crops and mineral outputs that fed 3 neighboring species. The latest trade agreement would hand control of those shipping lanes to the Ethon Dominion without a single credit going back to the human colonies that kept them running. Nathan had the numbers. He had the charts. He had a calm, clear argument ready. He waited for his turn. When it came, he stood up and began to speak. He kept his voice even. He explained the situation without drama. He pointed out that the new agreement was not balanced. He said the human colonies needed a fair share of the revenue they were generating. He asked the council to table the vote until a review could be done. Councillor Veyrath of the Ethon Dominion did not look up from his tablet the entire time Nathan was speaking. He was a tall creature with pale silver skin and 4 thin fingers on each hand. He scrolled through something on his screen with a slow, bored expression. Around him, other senior delegates whispered to each other, smiled at private jokes, and waited for the human to finish. Nathan finished. He sat down. The vote passed within 4 minutes. The trade agreement was approved. The human colonies in the outer belt would receive nothing. Nathan wrote 1 word in his notebook. He drew a small box around it. Then he closed the notebook and put it in his bag. After the session ended, the chamber emptied quickly. Delegates moved to private lounges and dinner meetings. Nathan walked alone down the long corridor back to the human delegation suite. The floors were polished stone. His footsteps were very quiet. Dr. Laura Sims was waiting for him inside. She was a small woman with dark eyes and short hair, and she had a habit of standing very still when she was thinking hard. She had been watching the session feed on a wall screen. She turned it off when Nathan came in. He set his bag on the table. He poured himself a glass of water. He drank it slowly. Then he said, quietly, that he wanted her to pull up the exit checklist. She looked at him for a moment. She asked if he meant the full one. He said yes. The full one. She nodded and sat down at her desk. What happened next took almost no time at all, which was the strangest part of it. There was no argument inside the delegation suite. There was no moment of doubt or long debate. Nathan and Laura had both been watching the pattern for a long time. 18 months of proposals that went nowhere. 18 months of being talked over, voted down, and quietly pushed out of every real decision. They had kept detailed records because Nathan believed in keeping records. The records told a very clear story. The story was that this was not an accident. The Ethon Dominion had been working for nearly 2 years to reduce human influence on the council. Not loudly. Not with any direct confrontation. Just slowly, vote by vote, committee by committee, making sure that humans were always just outside the room where the real choices were made. Other species had gone along with it because the Ethon Dominion was powerful and it was easier to go along. Nathan sent a secure message to Secretary General Dara Okafor back on Earth. It was not a long message. It explained what had happened in the session. It attached the 18 months of records. It ended with a single recommendation. Okafor received it at her desk in the early morning, Earth time. She read it carefully. She read the attached records less carefully because she had already seen most of them before. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. Then she opened a drawer, took out a single sheet of official paper, wrote 4 lines on it, and signed her name at the bottom. The paper authorized the formal withdrawal of the human delegation from the Galactic Council, effective immediately and without public announcement. She placed the signed paper in an outgoing file. She poured her coffee. She went on with her morning. Back on Kelarath Prime, the process was quiet and organized. It did not look like a dramatic exit. It looked like a tidy office being packed up by people who took pride in leaving things clean. Nathan went through the checklist item by item. Borrowed equipment was returned to the council's logistics office with a polite note of thanks. Shared databases were closed out properly. Accounts were settled. The human delegation's encrypted communication channel sent an automated message to council administration explaining that Earth's diplomatic calendar was under review and that all future inquiries could be directed to a contact address. Laura packed her personal items into 2 small bags. She checked every drawer twice. She made sure the plants in the window had been watered by the building's automated system before she left, because she did not want them to die. The other human staff moved the same way. Quietly, efficiently, without drama. A few of them said goodbye to alien colleagues they had worked alongside for years. They kept the goodbyes short and warm. Nobody explained anything. Nobody needed to. The last night before departure, Nathan sat alone in the main office and looked out at the city below. Kelarath Prime was a beautiful place. The lights from 1,000 species districts mixed together in ways that should not have worked but somehow did. He had liked living here. He had believed in what they were trying to do here. He thought about that for a while. Then he went to bed. The next morning, Laura was the last one left in the delegation suite. She walked through every room one final time. She turned off the lights in each one. She checked the lock on the filing cabinet that now held nothing. She picked up her bags. She stood at the door for one moment. Then she walked out. The door locked automatically behind her. It made a soft click. Outside, the sun of Kelarath Prime was coming up. The city was beginning to fill with the ordinary sounds of 1,000 different kinds of people going about their day. Nobody on the street below noticed the woman with 2 bags walking toward the transit station. There was no announcement. There was no press release. Earth's diplomatic feeds updated quietly to show the delegation office as temporarily closed for administrative review. On Kelarath Prime, the human seat at the council table stayed empty. On Earth, life continued exactly as it always had. Scientists ran their experiments. Factories turned out their products. Ships carried their cargo between the human worlds of the Sol system and the outer colonies. They just stopped going to Kelarath Prime. Nobody said why. Nobody needed to say why. The door had clicked shut, and the lights were off, and the plants would be fine because the automated system would water them on schedule whether the humans were there or not. That was the thing about humans. They planned ahead. They made sure everything was taken care of before they left. They were very, very good at that. Humanity walked away without a word. And the Galactic Council begged for their return. Part 2, the galaxy notices the absence. The first person to notice was a clerk. His name was Devet, a young Ethon functionary who worked in the council's scheduling office on Kelarath Prime. It was his job to prepare the attendance rolls before each session. On the morning 3 weeks after the human delegation had quietly packed up and left, Devet walked into the main chamber, looked at the row of delegate name cards on the curved table, and noticed that the human section was still empty. He checked his records. He sent a routine inquiry to the human delegation contact address. He received a polite automated reply thanking him for his message and explaining that Earth's diplomatic calendar was currently under review. He filed the inquiry under pending and moved on to his other tasks. He did not tell anyone, because he did not think it was his place. Nobody else said anything either, not for another 3 weeks. Senior delegates assumed the humans were between representatives, or dealing with some internal matter, or simply taking their time the way humans sometimes did. The sessions continued. Votes were taken. Business was conducted. The business felt slightly odd. Several delegates mentioned it to each other in private but could not quite explain why. The chamber was the same size. The agenda was the same length. But there was something about the empty chairs in the human section that sat in the back of the mind in an unpleasant way, like a word you could not quite remember. Councillor Veyrath did not mention it at all. He had been very satisfied with how the last several sessions had gone. The trade agreement had passed. The redistribution of outer belt shipping routes was proceeding smoothly. The Ethon Dominion was in a strong position. He was not going to spend energy worrying about an empty chair. But then the reports started coming in. The first one came from trade speaker Meredith of the Velhari Exchange. She was a heavy-set woman with a blunt manner that made some council members uncomfortable. She sent a formal memo to the council's economic subcommittee. The memo was short and direct. It said that human-manufactured medical synthesizers had stopped shipping to Velhari distribution centers. No explanation had been given. No replacement source had been identified. The Velhari Health Ministry was asking questions that Meredith did not have answers to. The subcommittee shelved the memo. They marked it as an item for follow-up and moved on. 3 days later, Meredith sent a second memo. This one had more numbers in it. Meanwhile, Intelligence Director Sova of the Ethon Dominion had quietly opened a file on human activity. Sova was a careful, precise creature who trusted data above everything else. She had begun collecting information not because anyone had asked her to, but because the situation had started to feel like something she should understand better. What she found was confusing at first, and then deeply uncomfortable. Earth was not in crisis. That was the first thing she confirmed. There was no civil war, no environmental disaster, no political collapse. The human government was functioning normally. Human colony worlds were functioning normally. If anything, the economic output of human-aligned systems had gone up slightly in the past month. The communications she intercepted were dense with technical language. Humans talked to each other about projects she did not have names for. They sent long, detailed messages about engineering work and research outcomes and construction timelines. She could understand the individual words but not always what they added up to. There was a phrase that appeared frequently in human internal communications during this period. Translated roughly, it meant something like, "Finally, we have time to do this properly." She noted it in her file and stared at it for a long time. Councillor Veyrath received Sova's preliminary report on a Tuesday morning. He read it at his desk with a calm expression. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the wall. He had been certain, when the trade agreement passed, that the human delegation would file a formal protest within the week. He had prepared a response. He had been ready for noise and complaints and the long, slow process of making humans accept the outcome. He was very experienced at that process. Instead, there had been silence. 6 weeks of silence. And the silence was starting to feel much heavier than any protest would have. He sent an official inquiry to the human delegation contact address, using careful and formal council language. He received the same automated reply that the scheduling clerk had received weeks before. The diplomatic calendar was under review. "Thank you for your message." He read it twice. He put it in a drawer. Trade speaker Meredith delivered her concerns in person at a closed session of the Economic Subcommittee. She brought a presentation, which was unusual because she was not known for making presentations. The fact that she had made one told the room something about how serious she was. The numbers were not catastrophic yet. But the direction they were pointing was very clear. Human medical synthesizers were part of 17 separate supply chains across 9 species health systems. Human navigation computation software processed approximately 40% of all jump point calculations in the outer transit corridors. Human atmospheric engineering teams had been maintaining 3 climate stabilization projects on non-Earth worlds under long-term contracts. Every one of those contracts had been quietly put on administrative hold by Earth's relevant agencies. Nobody in the subcommittee had known all of those things at once before. Most of them had known 1 or 2 pieces. Hearing them together in the same room, laid out in order, was a completely different experience. After Meredith's presentation, there was a long silence. Then one junior delegate said carefully that perhaps someone should send a trade envoy to speak with Earth directly. The envoy was sent. He was a capable diplomat named Orith, and he traveled to the outer human way station at the edge of Earth's territorial markers with good intentions and a well-prepared portfolio of topics to discuss. The human staff at the way station were pleasant. They offered him a comfortable room and excellent food. They explained that all meetings with Earth diplomatic representatives required appointments, and that the current scheduling window for new appointments was approximately 4 months. Orith sent a message back to the council. He then sat in his comfortable room and looked at the human star charts on the wall and thought about what 4 months meant. Back on Kelarath Prime, someone proposed a council resolution formally condemning the human withdrawal as a breach of interstellar cooperation agreements. The resolution was put to a vote. It failed. Not because anyone stood up to defend the humans. Nobody made a speech about justice or fairness. The resolution failed because 3 separate species submitted quiet abstentions at the last moment. Each of them had their own reasons, and the reasons were all different, but they all came down to the same calculation. If the humans were going to eventually come back, it might not be wise to have voted to condemn them while they were gone. Meredith watched the failed vote from her seat and said nothing. She had not voted to condemn. She had voted against it, which was a different thing, and she had not explained herself to anyone. Sova added the failed vote to her file. She was building a picture, and the picture was becoming clearer every day, and she did not like what it showed. What it showed was that the Galactic Council, the great governing body of 47 spacefaring species, had spent 18 months very carefully pushing the humans to one side, and had done so with the full confidence that the humans would simply accept it, the way they always had before. Nobody had stopped to ask what would happen if they did not. Nobody had thought to look at how many things were quietly running on human hands, human minds, and human patience before deciding that all 3 were unimportant. The empty chairs in the human section of the chamber looked exactly the same as they had looked 6 weeks ago. But they felt very different now. They felt like a question that nobody in the room knew how to answer. Humanity walked away without a word. And the Galactic Council begged for their return. Part 3: What Humans Do When Left Alone. Nathan Cole slept well on his first night back on Earth. This surprised him. He had expected to lie awake, turning things over in his mind. 6 years on Kellerath Prime left a person with a lot of habits and a brain that had learned to stay slightly on guard even when everything seemed calm. But the bed in his old apartment in Portland was exactly as he had left it, and the rain on the window sounded like home, and he was asleep before he had time to think about anything at all. He spent his first week doing almost nothing. He walked to the market. He cooked his own meals for the first time in years. He called his sister, who lived in Denver and had 2 kids he barely knew anymore. They talked for 2 hours. It was the longest personal conversation he had managed in a very long time. Then the government asked if he would consult on something called the Recalibration Project, and he said yes, because sitting still entirely was never something Nathan was good at. The Recalibration Project was not a dramatic name for a dramatic thing. It was, in essence, a very large and very careful review. Every agreement humanity had made with alien species over the past 40 years was being examined line by teams of economists, engineers, lawyers, and scientists. The question they were trying to answer was simple: what had actually been good for humanity, and what had simply been accepted because arguing was exhausting and the results were the same either way. Nathan read the first batch of reports on a rainy Tuesday morning and drank 3 cups of coffee doing it. The reports were honest, which he appreciated. Some of the agreements had been genuinely good. Some had been mediocre but not harmful. And some of them, particularly the ones negotiated in the last 8 years when the Ethon Dominion had been tightening its grip on council policy, had been bad deals that humans had accepted because the alternative was being ignored anyway. He wrote notes in the margins. He sent comments to the review teams. He found, to his own mild surprise, that the work was interesting in a way that council diplomacy had not been for a very long time. Dr. Laura Sims was working harder than she had worked in years, and she was genuinely happier for it. Her team had been given a single task: build a better communication framework. For as long as humanity had been part of the Galactic Council, interstellar communication had run on protocols designed by a committee of 7 species 40 years ago. The protocols worked, but they were slow and clunky and full of translation gaps that caused misunderstandings every week. Every time a human team had suggested improvements, the proposal had gone into a subcommittee and never come out again. Now there was no subcommittee. There was just Laura and her team and a very large whiteboard covered in diagrams. They worked long days and argued about everything and built 3 separate versions of the framework before agreeing that the second one was the best foundation and the third had the better translation structure and they should combine them. The combined version was faster, cleaner, and more accurate than anything currently in use anywhere in the known galaxy. Laura knew this because she had tested it against every existing system she could access, and the results were not close. She was proud of it in a way that felt solid, like something real sitting in her chest. She had been proud of her work before, but always in a context where someone else had the final say on whether it was good enough. This time the work was just good. It was hers. Nobody was going to bury it in committee review. Admiral Grace Tanner was, by her own description, having the best year of her career. The Earth Exploration Directorate had existed for decades, but for most of that time it had operated under real limits. Council-mapped territory could not be surveyed without permission. Jump routes through alien-controlled space required permits that took years to process. Several entire regions of the outer galaxy had been declared off-limits for what were described as jurisdictional reasons, which in practice meant that the species who controlled the nearest transit points did not want anyone else finding out what was there. With the withdrawal, those limits no longer applied in any practical sense. Earth still followed its own laws. It did not enter clearly inhabited systems without invitation. But the Council's mapping restrictions had been Council rules, and humanity was no longer bound by Council rules. Admiral Tanner sent 6 survey teams into previously restricted regions within the first 2 months. The data they brought back was extraordinary. 3 systems had breathable atmospheres on at least one planet. 2 had water in liquid form. 1 had plant life of a kind no one had recorded before. And 1 had ruins. The ruins were on a cold, quiet moon orbiting a gas giant 6 weeks of travel from Earth's nearest colony. Nobody had been there before, or if they had not told anyone. The survey team's initial photographs showed stone structures arranged in deliberate patterns, worn down by what the geologists estimated to be at least 10,000 years of weather. The structures were not large or dramatic. But they were unmistakably made by something with intent and purpose, something that had looked up at the gas giant above and built things on the ground with a plan in mind. The team sent their report back marked as high priority. Admiral Tanner read it on a Friday afternoon and had to sit down for a moment before she could respond properly. She approved a follow-up mission immediately. Dr. Paul Mercer said nothing publicly about the propulsion test, because he had been asked not to, and because he understood perfectly well why. His team had been working on the new drive system for 4 years. The basic theory had been sound from the start, but the engineering problems were serious, and for 3 of those 4 years they had been doing the work alongside all the other demands that came with being a species embedded in a complex interstellar political structure. There had always been something else urgent. There had always been a committee that needed a report or a council session that needed preparation. Now there was just the work. The first full-scale test ran on a Wednesday. The results were well above what the models had predicted. Mercer's team celebrated with bad coffee and a very long conversation that went in every direction at once, the way good conversations do when something important has just happened. Nobody made a formal announcement. Nobody sent a press release. The data went into a secured archive, and the team went back to work on the next phase. On the colony worlds, the changes were smaller but just as real. Local governments had always operated under a layer of council compliance requirements, approved materials lists, registered technology standards, certified construction methods. These rules had been built up over decades by committees that rarely included anyone who actually lived on the worlds being regulated. Without the compliance overhead, builders started using what actually worked best in their local conditions. Farmers grew what their soil genuinely supported rather than council-approved varieties designed for average conditions on average planets. Local energy projects that had been stalled for years in certification processes got approved by local engineers in a matter of weeks. The economic growth numbers from the colony worlds in the first quarter after the withdrawal were the highest anyone had recorded in a generation. The officials who compiled the data checked them 3 times before publishing, because the numbers looked too good to trust. They were correct. Secretary General Okafor gave a public address 11 minutes long. She talked about the ruins on the cold moon. She talked about the children who had already started saying they wanted to be archaeologists when they grew up. She talked about the new atmospheric models that Laura's communication work had made possible. She mentioned the Galactic Council exactly once, in a single sentence, in passing, as a former diplomatic obligation. She did not sound angry. She did not sound triumphant. She sounded like someone talking about the future because the future was genuinely interesting and there was a great deal of it ahead. Intelligence Director Sova intercepted the broadcast and had it analyzed by a team of specialists. They spent 2 days looking for hidden messages, coded language, and deliberate signals buried in the phrasing. They found nothing. The humans were genuinely excited about old stones on a cold moon. The Secretary General had talked for 11 minutes about archaeology and children and atmospheric science. Sova added the analysis to her file. She sat with it for a long time. Then she wrote at the bottom of her notes, in her own small handwriting, "They are not waiting for us to notice. They have already moved on." She did not show that line to anyone. But she did not cross it out either. Humanity walked away without a word. And the Galactic Council begged for their return. Part 4, the Council reaches out. The 14 ships had been sitting in the outer transit corridor for 9 days when the Council finally admitted there was a problem. The ships were cargo vessels, all of them registered to different operators, all of them carrying different loads. What they had in common was that they had all tried to calculate their jump route through the Velhari corridor using the standard navigation software provided by the Council's transit authority. The software had given each of them a different set of coordinates. When the coordinates turned out to contradict each other, 3 ships had tried to resolve the problem by averaging the 2 readings and had ended up stuck in a dead zone between transit points with no clear path forward. It was not a dangerous situation. The ships were not going to crash. But they were stuck, and the longer they stayed stuck, the more expensive it became, and the more people started asking questions about why the Council's navigation system had failed in a corridor that had been working without problems for 30 years. The Council's transit authority spent 4 days trying to fix the problem from the inside. They ran the calculations again. They updated their databases. They contacted 3 separate technical teams. Nothing worked. On the 5th day, a junior analyst in the transit authority looked up from his desk and said quietly that the problem was not in the software they were running. The problem was in the underlying calculation structure. The transit authority had been using a correction framework developed by Earth's Navigation Bureau 8 years ago. At some point in the past 2 months, the automated update license for that framework had lapsed because no one had renewed it. The office responsible for renewing it had been the Human Delegation's logistics desk on Kelarath Prime, which no longer existed. The room went very quiet when he said that. The Transit Authority's director sent an emergency request to the human diplomatic contact address that same afternoon. She received the polite automated reply about the diplomatic calendar being under review. She sent a follow-up marked urgent. She received the same reply. She sent a third message, this one addressed directly to Earth's Navigation Bureau. The Navigation Bureau responded within 6 hours. The message was professional and warm. It said the Bureau was glad to help and had already reviewed the data. It provided a corrected calculation framework with full instructions for use. It also noted, gently, that a renewed licensing agreement would be needed within 90 days to keep access to future updates. The 14 ships were moving again by the next morning. Nobody at the Council discussed it in official sessions. But everyone knew what had happened, and the knowledge sat in every meeting for weeks afterward, unspoken and impossible to ignore. Councillor Veyrath called an emergency closed session 2 weeks after the navigation incident. It was not on the public schedule. The invitation went to senior delegates only, by private channel, with a request that attendance be treated as confidential. He had never done anything like that before. The fact that he was doing it now told the other delegates everything they needed to know about how seriously he was taking the situation. He stood at the front of the room and spoke for a long time. He was not known for long speeches. He was precise and efficient and usually said what needed to be said in as few words as possible. But this time he talked for 40 minutes, and the room was completely silent the entire time. He said that the Council had made a series of errors. He named them specifically. He said the decisions of the past 18 months, which he had supported and in some cases directly driven, had been made without a full understanding of what human participation meant for the functioning of the galactic community. He said the navigation incident was not an isolated problem. It was a sign of something deeper. He said he had reviewed the intelligence files and the economic reports and the records of every technical service contract that Earth's agencies had quietly put on hold, and the picture those documents formed together was not a comfortable one. He did not apologize. That was not something Councillor Veyrath did. But he said clearly, in front of witnesses, that the situation needed to change. The debate that followed ran for 6 hours. Nobody argued about whether to reach out to humanity. That question was settled before anyone spoke. The debate was about how to do it, because simply sending a message felt insufficient given what had happened, and because several delegates were quietly worried about whether the humans would respond at all. Ambassador-elect Sinha of the Petheri Compact raised her hand during the 5th hour and said she would go herself. She was young for her rank, with a reputation for being direct and fair-minded. She had not been on the council when the problematic trade votes were taken. She was not associated with the decisions that had driven humanity away. She said she understood she might not be welcomed. She said she would go anyway and wait for however long it took. The room agreed. There was not much else to decide after that. Cinna traveled to the outer human way station at the edge of Earth's territorial space. She arrived with a small team, a formal document written on council-certified paper, and very little certainty about what would happen next. The human staff received her with complete courtesy. They showed her to a comfortable suite. They brought meals at regular intervals. They made sure the temperature and lighting were right for a Petheri visitor. They were warm and professional and said nothing at all about politics. When she asked about a meeting, they explained that appointments were required and that the current scheduling window was several weeks out. She said she understood. She said she would wait. She waited. Nathan received the briefing on Cinna's arrival on a Wednesday afternoon. He was in a government building in Portland, reviewing the third section of a recalibration project report on historical mineral agreements. He set the report aside and read the briefing twice. Then he went to the small kitchen down the hall and made a cup of tea. He stood at the window while the kettle heated and looked at the street below. It was raining, the ordinary Portland kind of rain that felt like the city was simply breathing. A woman was walking a dog. A delivery vehicle hummed past slowly. He thought about Kelarath Prime and the council chambers and the vote that had passed in 4 minutes while he sat at the table and nobody looked at him once. He finished his tea. He went back to his desk. He picked up his communication unit and called Secretary General Okafor. He read her the formal message that Cinna had carried from the council. It was a long document, written with care. It acknowledged specific wrongs. It named specific votes. It expressed the council's formal recognition that the pattern of exclusion over the past 18 months had been deliberate and had caused real harm. It asked, in serious and measured language, for resumed relations between humanity and the Galactic Council. When he finished reading, Okafor was quiet for a moment. She asked whether the council had changed its voting structure to prevent the same thing from happening again. Nathan said not yet. He said the document expressed willingness to negotiate on that point. She asked whether the specific trade resolutions that had stripped resource rights from the Outer Belt colonies had been formally reviewed. Nathan said they had been acknowledged in the document and marked for renegotiation. She was quiet again, longer this time. Then she said they would respond. Not yes. Not no. She said Nathan should arrange a meeting and bring Laura Sims with him. She said to choose somewhere that was not Earth and not Kelarath Prime. Somewhere neutral. Somewhere that belonged to neither side. Nathan said he knew a place. There was a colony called Arden's Rest, 8 hours from Earth by conventional transit. It had a small government building with a conference hall that had never been used for anything important. Okafor said that sounded just right. Then she asked how the ruins investigation was going, and Nathan spent 10 minutes telling her about the latest geological dating results and the ongoing debate among the archaeologists about whether the stone formations were meant to track the movement of the gas giant or the growing seasons of a crop that no longer existed. Okafor listened with genuine curiosity, asking small questions, and neither of them mentioned the council again until the following morning. Outside, at the way station, Ambassador-elect Cinna sat in her comfortable room and looked at the stars and waited. She was learning to be good at waiting. She had decided she would need to be. Humanity walked away without a word. And the Galactic Council begged for their return. Part 5, the terms are ours to set. Arden's Rest was a small colony, and the conference hall in its government building had bare walls and plain chairs and a long table that someone had polished until it reflected the ceiling lights. It smelled faintly of wood and cleaning solution. Outside the windows, the colony's modest skyline sat against a gray morning sky, quiet and ordinary. Nathan had chosen the location deliberately. Not Earth, which would have made the humans seem like they were holding court in their own house. Not Kelarath Prime, which carried too much weight of everything that had gone wrong there. Arden's Rest had no history between them yet. It was just a place where people lived and worked, and that felt like the right kind of ground to start on. The council representatives arrived first. Cinna came in quietly with 2 advisors and a communications aide. Councillor Veyrath arrived separately, with only a single translator beside him. Nathan noticed that. Coming with one person instead of a large delegation was a choice, and it was the kind of choice that told you something about how a person understood the meeting they were walking into. Laura Sims came in with Nathan. She was carrying her tablet and wearing a calm expression. She had mentioned over breakfast that she had slept well the night before, as if this were useful information. Nathan had agreed that it probably was. They sat down across from the council representatives at the long table. The chairs were comfortable. Someone had put water in plain cups in the center, which Nathan appreciated. It meant nobody was trying to make the room feel more important than it needed to be. He opened without any introduction. He said Earth was willing to discuss resumed participation in the Galactic Council. He said the terms of that participation were not going to be the same as before, and that this was not a negotiating position but simply a fact, and that it was better for everyone to understand that clearly from the beginning. Then he placed a document on the table and slid it across. Cinna picked it up and read it carefully. She read slowly and without rushing, which Nathan respected. Her two advisors leaned in to read alongside her. Veyrath sat still and did not reach for the document, but his eyes moved steadily across the text as Cinna held it. The document had 3 main sections. The first was about voting. Under the current council structure, resolutions affecting human-aligned systems could be passed by a majority that included no human votes at all. The new framework required that any vote with direct economic or territorial consequences for human-aligned systems include a 60-day review period and could not be finalized without a documented response from Earth's delegation. This was not a veto. It was time and a voice, which were 2 things that humans had not actually had before, despite the appearance of having them. The second section was about acknowledgement. It created a formal process for raising and recording grievances about procedural exclusion, with a clear mechanism for independent review. Cinna spent the longest time on this section. Her advisors exchanged a look. Nathan watched them without any expression in particular. The third section was the shortest. It said that the terms of any future agreement involving human technology, human expertise, or human labor would be set by Earth's relevant agencies in direct negotiation with the relevant parties, and would not be determined by General Council vote. What humans built and what humans agreed to share were human decisions. This had always been technically true in principle. The document simply made it impossible to pretend otherwise in practice. Cinna set the document down. She asked 3 questions. Nathan answered each one fully. Laura added a technical detail to the second answer, which Cinna listened to carefully and nodded at. Cinna said she thought the framework was serious and fair. She said she believed the council could accept most of it with limited adjustment. She said the voting structure section would face resistance from some members, but that she personally believed it pointed in the right direction. Nathan said he was glad to hear her read it that way. He said the voting section was not something that could be removed, only refined in language. There was a pause. Cinna glanced at Veyrath. Veyrath was looking at the table. Then Laura said she had something to show them, and she placed her tablet in the center of the table and played a demonstration of the communication framework her team had built. It ran for 4 minutes. It showed a live translation exchange between 3 different language systems, running faster and more accurately than anything currently in use, with error correction built into every layer and a clear visual display that made complex structure readable at a glance. It was, by any honest measure, extraordinary work. Cinna leaned forward slightly without seeming to notice she had done it. One of her advisors said something in a low voice that the translator did not catch. Laura said the framework was maintained by her team and could be made available to Council communication systems as part of the renewed relationship. It would be managed by Earth's Xenolinguistics Bureau. Access would be part of the formal agreement. She said all of this in a plain and even tone, without any particular emphasis. She did not need emphasis. Everyone in the room understood perfectly well what it meant. Veyrath spoke for the first time since sitting down. He asked whether Earth would be willing to discuss its recent propulsion research at a future session. Nathan said they would be glad to discuss Earth's internal research programs once a productive working relationship had been established and had shown itself to be stable over time. Veyrath was quiet for a moment. Then he gave a single nod. They took a 2-hour break at midday. Nathan ate a plain sandwich at the table in the hallway outside the conference room. Laura sat across from him and read something on her tablet. They did not talk very much. They did not need to. When the afternoon session began, the work became detailed and slow and careful. Cinna's advisors had notes. Nathan had notes. 2 points took longer than expected. 1 point that everyone had expected to be difficult turned out not to be. In the final hour, Cinna asked to speak on something not on the formal agenda. Nathan said of course. She said the council understood now that it had taken humanity for granted. She said she wanted to be careful not to call it a simple mistake or an oversight, because the record was clear enough that it had been more deliberate than that. She said she could not speak for decisions made before her current role, but she could speak for the direction she believed the council needed to move, and that direction was toward a table that was genuinely shared. Nathan said he appreciated her saying it plainly. Then Councillor Veyrath asked to speak. He said, in his own language, a sentence that took Laura a moment to translate. She said it meant something close to, "We did not know what we had until we chose to treat it as something we could afford to lose." The room was quiet. Nathan looked at him steadily. He said that he appreciated the honesty, and that he meant it. Secretary General Okafor joined the session for the final hour by secure link from Earth. She appeared on the screen at the end of the table, unhurried and clear-eyed. She read through the agreed terms. She asked 2 questions, both short and precise, both answered fully. She looked directly at the camera for a moment before she signed. The council representatives signed. Cinna signed on behalf of the full body, with Veyrath as the witness. It was done. The council representatives gathered their materials and said their quiet goodbyes. Cinna shook Nathan's hand with both of hers, which was the Petheri way of showing real sincerity. Veyrath gave a single formal nod to the room and walked out. His translator hurried after him. The door closed. Nathan and Laura were alone in the conference hall. The lights were still on. The cups on the table were still half full of water. Through the window, Arden's Rest was moving into the later part of the afternoon, and the colony lights were beginning to come on one by one against the gray sky. Laura set her tablet down and stretched her arms above her head. She asked if he thought it would hold. He said he thought it might. The structure was better than what they had before. The mechanisms were real. Cinna was someone he believed would push to make it work. She asked what happened if it did not. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said they would handle it the same way they had handled this. She thought about that for a moment. She said that seemed right. She picked up her tablet and her bag. He picked up his notebook. They turned off the conference room light. The hallway outside was quiet, and the building around them was going about its ordinary end-of-day routine, people finishing up their work and heading home, doors opening and closing, the soft sounds of a place that had nothing to do with any of this and was simply, quietly, continuing to exist. They went to get dinner at a small place around the corner that someone on the local government staff had recommended. It served simple food and the portions were generous and the seats by the window looked out onto the main street of the colony. They talked about the ruins on the cold moon for most of the meal. The latest geological dating results had just come in, and there was a real argument forming among the archaeologists about whether the stone formations had been built to track the movement of the gas giant overhead or the growing seasons of a crop that had long since disappeared. Laura had strong opinions. Nathan had careful questions. They went back and forth for a long time and did not settle anything, which was exactly the right outcome for that kind of conversation. They paid the bill and walked back to the transit terminal in the dark, their breath visible in the cold air, the stars above the colony's modest skyline very bright and very far away. Humanity was back at the table. But it was a different table now, with honest terms and a structure built on reality instead of appearance, and everyone who had been in that room understood, even without saying it, that the humans could get up and leave again if they needed to. That knowledge, quiet and simple and requiring no weapons and no threats and no ultimatum of any kind, was the thing that made all the difference. Nathan and Laura walked on through the dark and the cold. There was a great deal of work ahead of them. They were, both of them, looking forward to it.